Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. It's a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including those who are most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts of all of those who have been impacted and who are representing these issues related to criminal legal reform. We ask you, the viewers, to join Both Sides of the Bars by sharing your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society SOC. Today we have a very exciting show for you today, as always, and we thought it was important, especially in this climate and in this day and time in the criminal legal reform movement, to begin to address some issues that's happening, particularly in prisons throughout this country. And today's show is entitled Beyond the Count, a deep dive into the state prison populations. We know that in the United States, there is a criminal justice system, but it has many elements and components that it makes up. There are thousands of federal, state, local, and tribal systems. And together, these systems hold about 2 million people in 1,566 state prisons, 102 federal prisons, 2,850 local jails, 1,500 or so juvenile correction facilities, 186 detention facilities, and 82 Indian County jails, as well as the military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in U.S. territories. So the criminal legal system in its entirety is made up of these different parts and pieces, but today we'll focus on state prisons populations. And we have our guest that's joining us today, and that data from which I spoke about just now was pulled from a report done by the person who works with this organization. The guest we have today is Wanda Bertram. She is a communications strategist at the Prison Policy Initiative, which produces cutting-edge research to expose the broader harm of mass criminalization. Wanda, thank you so much for joining us here today at Both Sides of the Bars. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Andre.
Absolutely. And, your report that you just put out was a seminal report, obviously, in the analysis, the data therein, certainly is something that we wanted our listener audience to hear about and our viewers to know about because of its importance. And, over 1 million people are confined in New York State prisons, or rather state prisons generally throughout the country. And you're going to talk a little about that. And we know that the Prison Policy Initiative is a Northampton, Massachusetts-based nonprofit organization, and in this analysis that is just put out is a reflection of all the great work you've done. So again, thanks so much for joining us for this amazing show. So let's talk about it. Let's get right into it, right? I mean, a lot of people incarcerated in this country, 1 million of whom are in prison. Talk a little bit about that, like that data and that finding. What does that mean?
Our organization, exists to do a couple things. First, and I would call this the most important part of our work, we help people who are doing on-the-ground advocacy related to mass incarceration get the data that they need in order to make the case against mass criminalization, right? So, for example, if your county is considering building a bigger jail, which is just going to expand the capacity of the criminal justice system to arrest more people, right? Bring more people into the system. We will help you. We will help you get the data that you need to push back on law enforcement so that they don't do that. So that's what I'd call the most important part of our work. But the other thing that we do is we provide public-facing reports such that people in the public can come and they can read our reports and they can see various important statistics related to mass incarceration. So it's sort of a self-serve. Our website is kind of a self-serve version of the stuff that we do sort of on the back end. The report that we released recently, Beyond the Count, is one of the most important reports we've ever produced, in my opinion. It's a report that goes deep into the most recent demographic data about people in state prisons. Now that's people in state prisons way more than in federal prisons, and dives into who those people are and where they come from, what their childhoods were like, what their adolescent years were like, and what their lives were like in the immediate lead up to incarceration.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about that, right, let's talk about race as it relates to the report that you put out. How relevant is that, and what does that mean in your report?
Well, I think that race is something that intersects with a lot of the other factors that we looked at, right? If you're watching this show, you're probably very familiar with the racial disparities in prisons and jails, right? That Black people in particular are a vastly overrepresented group in prisons and in jails in this country, and that's part of, unfortunately, this long legacy of racism and the history of racism that we have in this country going back to slavery. Native American people are also overrepresented. Latino people are all overrepresented. So that's a key part of it. But people always are wondering in the immediate term, right? In the recent past, what has actually caused that to be the case? And that's an open question, frankly. That's something that research is still digging into and still bearing out. And so just to talk about that for a moment, what our report has shown is that, well, for one thing, it affirms what some economists have already unearthed, which is that Black people are way more likely to be growing up in poverty in this country, right? Way more likely to be on forms of public assistance, and as we know, unfortunately, we do not have a government that is interested in caring for people who are on public assistance, caring for people who are in poverty, especially caring for kids who grew up in poverty. Instead, our government is interested in kicking people who are on public assistance until they get off public assistance, and it's interested in punishing kids who are growing up in poverty and who and just surveilling them until they can find something that a kid's done wrong and then throwing them in a correctional facility. We can talk about why that is, but just to start off with this, that's happening way more often to Black kids than to white kids nationwide, and so it starts people's interactions with the justice system very, very early on.
Speaking of kids, right? We're talking about age, right? How does age relate to the statewide, or rather not the nationwide, state prison population? What is the relationship and intersection between age and those who are in state prisons throughout the country?
Yeah, well, we looked at age demographics. In particular, we were trying to find out what's the portion of the state prison population that is on the young side, and what's the portion of the state prison population that's on the older side. Largely because we know that state prisons are places that are not capable of caring for people who are on the older side and have all of the more aggravated or chronic health conditions that come with being old. And we're also looking at how many people are young, because we know that before a certain age, commonly thought of as age 25 or so, people's brains aren't fully developed, right? And so that's something that we can look into. What we found was that over the last, I want to say, 20, 30 years, the number of older people in prisons has gone up a lot, and the number of younger people in prisons has gone down. This, I think, is attributable to more and more states raising the age for criminalization, so putting fewer young people through the process of adult court, or sentencing fewer young people to incarceration with adults, and that's good. But what it means is that over the last 30 years, as our state prison population has gone up and up and up and up, the age demographic that is driving that increase is older people. Right? It's people who were sentenced a long time ago and have spent the last 30 years getting older in prisons, or it's people who are older to begin with and they are committing crimes, often these days opioid-related crimes, right, to manage pain, and they're getting incarcerated for that. And so, that is what we know kind of at the basic level about the age demographics in prisons. I can say more about it because I think we also found some interesting data about the age people are at when they first get into the criminal justice system. So that's also interesting.
And what does that mean, right? The age when they're entering into the criminal legal system in that way? What is the relationship in all of that?
It means that the people that go into state prisons just don't have a chance. They never had a chance, right? 68% of people in state prisons report having had their first arrest before the age of 19. 38% report having their first arrest before the age of 16. And I should back up here and explain a little bit what this data set is. The data set that we used for this report is from what's called the Survey of Prison Inmates. It's produced erratically, but more or less once every 10 or 15 years by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. statistics. And this latest data set came out over the last couple of years. Nobody's really looked into it yet. We decided to be the first people to look into it.
Mhm.
And so what we found, all the data that we looked at when we did this report is all self-reported, right? These are the results of a survey. So this is what incarcerated people say about their own histories. And like I said, the majority of people in the state prison systems today report having had their first arrest when they were still a minor, still a child. And when you consider the fact that most of these people also report having grown up in poverty or report one or more indicators of poverty, you understand, this is not, we don't have a country where people who are on welfare as kids or people who are poor as kids are being taken care of. We have a country that is throwing those kids in prison. And I think that's, in my view, that is the biggest takeaway from the report. That's the thing that I really hope people, especially people who are not familiar with mass incarceration, come away from the report understanding.
So there's also been, Wanda, to your point, it seems as though there's a criminalization of poverty in some instances.
Yes.
And talk about that in addition to just the whole notion of the cost of incarceration, right? Because there's a criminalization of criminalization of poverty, and then by extension, you incarcerate someone. There's a cost to that. Talk about those two things.
I think that the criminalization of poverty, I might also just call it a criminalization of the working class, and in particular of the most marginalized parts of the working class. It's helpful to give some statistics. 42% of people in state prisons today grew up receiving public assistance. I think that's actually probably that's sort of an understatement of how many people who are in state prisons grew up maybe qualifying to be on welfare, because 33% of people in state prisons also grew up with a parent incarcerated. And as you may know, I'm sure you know, but as your listeners or your viewers may know, having a criminal record can disqualify you from certain welfare roles. So we assume that a very, very, very conservative estimate is that 40% or so of people in state prisons grew up on welfare. You were talking about the criminalization of poverty. Now, what is that? That's a big word that just means we have a criminal justice system that warehouses mostly poor people in prisons and jails. But why? I think that's a very interesting question that we're still studying. My view on it is that it's easier in the kind of economy and the kind of society that we have today, where a small number of very affluent people have captured the majority of the wealth and the majority of the power and want to hold on to it. It's easier it's easier to manage working people if you're, the kind of the boss class. The more vulnerable working people are. Now, there's basically no more expedient way to make a person vulnerable than to give them a criminal record and to put them in prison for a long period of time. You incarcerate somebody, you give them a felony record, and when they come out, when they're on parole and supervision, they no longer have the kind of agency that they did before they were incarcerated. You're up until very recently in New York, you could be reincarcerated for not making a solid enough effort to get a job, which is something that, whether or not you were doing that was entirely up to your parole officer to decide. Thankfully, they passed some law recently that makes it more difficult to do that, but it's still true in many, many states, including Massachusetts, where the Prison Policy Initiative is based, that people will be thrown back in prison on parole because they have not worked hard enough, quote unquote, to get a job. That renders workers more vulnerable in the labor market, because it means that you can't really say no to the jobs that you don't want to take. That increases the power of the bosses, increases the power of the affluent, the very wealthy. And so I think that is, mass incarceration is in my view, a very good thing for wealthy people in that way. And it's a very bad thing for working people, especially the poorest people.
When you talk about working people, or more specifically like poor people, right? Oftentimes living in conditions of poverty, when you look at social determinants of health, and people don't have the resources and supports that they need, oftentimes they may turn in on themselves because the conditions creates trauma. People sometimes normalize that kind of traumatic experience. Some use substances. Talk about like the drug use relationship between drug use pre-prison and how does that show up in your report?
Yeah. Well, what the demographic data show that we were pulling from this report, what those data show is that 65% of people in state prisons were using some kind of illicit substance in the immediate lead up to their incarceration. So the 30 days leading up to their incarceration, 65% of people in state prisons today were using drugs of some sort. We don't really know what drugs those were. And we also know that I think something around 50% of people in state prisons have been on probably mostly court ordered substance use treatment. What that I think should tell us is that the war on drugs is really big. We think about the war on drugs as something that only impacts people who are convicted of drug offenses. And if you look at the total sort of pie chart, we produce a pie chart every year showing what people are incarcerated for and where they're locked up. If you look at this pie chart, you see, okay, about 1 in 5 people in state prisons, local jails, and federal prisons are incarcerated for a drug offense.
Mhm.
Now, that can look, I mean, depending on your perspective, it can look kind of small
Sure.
because, a lot of people think, oh, mass incarceration is entirely due to the criminalization of drugs. Now, I mean, I think that we're always in a conversation about what the drug war has done. And I think that this data provides another really important notch in that conversation because what we can see is that, maybe only 20% of people in state prisons are there for a drug offense,
Mhm.
but 65% of people in state prisons were using illegal drugs. And if you're using illegal drugs in a country where drug use is criminalized, that can be used to get you for all number of things, right? It can be used prosecutors can leverage that against you, right? They can bring all kinds of charges. Police can use it as an excuse to get a warrant for your arrest. So the war on drugs, it facilitates all of this incarceration. And I would say that in some way, every single person who's in state prison today who is using illicit drugs before their incarceration is someone who has been directly impacted by the war on drugs.
One of the things that you mentioned inside of your report, again, I believe, at least from my vantage point, Wanda, is a similar work, is you talk about immigration, you talk about juvenile detention. For our
Mhm.
viewers, what does that mean? Some of them may not understand. Talk a little about the immigration and detention data and information that you cite inside of your report.
Right. Well, you can let me know what direction you want me to go in with this, but immigration detention is something that this country uses way more than basically any other country on earth. The same is true for juvenile detention.
Mhm.
We produce a report every few years where we actually rank US states and independent countries on their use of incarceration in total. And we don't even really bother to count the immigration detention and juvenile detention rates of other countries because it's actually just not done in
Mhm.
other countries that much, particularly in other countries that we would consider to be our peers nationwide,
Yeah.
other liberal capitalist democracies. It's just those things don't exist. In Within the report itself, yeah, I'm the thing that I think really stuck out to me, and this is kind of leading off of what I said before about the number of people in state prisons who had been arrested as children, is that 35% of people who are in state prisons today spent some time in juvenile detention when they were kids. A related statistic, I think, is that the average person in state prison today is 39 years old and has a 10th grade education.
Mhm.
I think that's related to the way that we punish kids for juvenile offenses because when you're incarcerated as a young person, that interrupts your education. It can't help but doing that. And once you're locked up, you come out of juvenile detention, you come out with a lot of trauma. You're probably returning to a school system that wasn't that good in the first place because these are folks that are growing up in underserved areas, places that have seen dwindling investment from the government, and so really what we're seeing is that we are failing children. Governments are deliberately failing kids that grow up in poor environments.
And it's interesting that you raised that point. And, I want to talk a little bit about, moving away from that, right? You talk about education, right?
Mhm.
There's been a movement now, the Governor Hochul here in New York State, Hochul,
Yeah.
she's obviously passed legislation now with the restoration of TAP, tuition assistance funding in prisons. What does that mean relative to your report? I know you talk about education within the report.
Yeah. My view on this, hopefully this is not too controversial, is that we really need to be evening the playing field for education a lot more. When I was a kid, I grew up in Seattle. I had some difficulties, being in the public schools, and So what my parents were able to do, because there were some scholarships available, was they sent me to a private school. A private school is something that private schools often have people there that we're struggling in the public school system, and that's not something that should be restricted to people who can afford it or people who are able to get scholarships. It should
Mhm.
not be something that private interests control, but it is. And on the other side of the tracks, as it were, you can see kids that grow up in these really underserved neighborhoods. If they're struggling in the public schools,
Yeah.
they're arrested, right? They're
Right.
put into correctional facilities. They're not seen as special. They're seen as, we're broken. We need to fix you.
Mhm.
And I think that until we fix that really, really profoundly broken part of our education system, and until we recognize how the criminal justice system and the holes in public education are linked, we are just going to keep struggling to put band-aids over the problem of adults in prisons and jails having missed so much of their education growing up.
And you talk about jails, right? I want to kind of get at that for a little bit because,
Hmm.
what about local jails, right? And this is allowing us to segue into bail reform in some way. So talk a
Hmm.
little bit about that. We had maybe about a few minutes left, 10, about maybe 7, 8 minutes or left or so. But
Right.
talk about local jails and the relationship between local jails and its impact as it relates to bail reform.
Right. Yeah. Local jails, just nationally, just to set the stage with some stats, local jails hold about a quarter to a third of people who are locked up on any given day. It's a
Throughout the
huge part
country.
of the throughout the country.
Yep.
Right. Exactly. It's a huge part of the criminal justice system. I think a lot of people don't know that because they think about mass incarceration as being, you're locked up because you committed a crime. But there are actually, 600, 700,000 odd people who are locked up on any given day in local jails, the vast majority of whom have not, I don't want to say not committed a crime because many of them have criminal records, but they are not convicted of the crimes of which they're accused, right? They're locked up because a judge has set some condition on their release that makes it impossible to go home. And, you mentioned money bail, which is a big part of it. Money bail is a pretty nasty system. It's a dragnet that pulls low income people into the criminal justice system because the average annual income of someone in jail who can't pay bail is $15,000.
Mhm.
In theory, right, money bail is an instrument that you can use to incentivize people who go home before their trial to come back to court, because you say you can't go home until you've paid your bail amount. But after you've paid your bail amount, you can recover it by coming back for your hearing. In theory, that's what money bail is supposed to do. It's supposed to be an incentive to bring people back. In
Right.
reality, the sad truth is that hundreds of thousands of people are locked up on any given day because judges are using money bail to keep people incarcerated. They're setting bail amounts that people cannot afford as a means of keeping them inside. And once you realize that, and once you realize how poor most people in jail are, and once you realize that the conviction rates across the country are, especially in major cities, are you know not 100%. That many people who are in jail pretrial are innocent, and that being held pretrial actually makes it more likely that they're going to plead guilty just to get out of jail. You realize what a crime it is, what a horrible thing it is that we are allowing judges to use this instrument to basically hold people pre-trial just because they're poor, making it more likely that they're going to plead guilty, no matter if they're guilty or not. So it's a system that's badly in need of reform, and I think that hopefully, hopefully we see some more movement against it. But we're actually already seeing backlash against bail reform, even in New York, where you and I both live.
Speaking of which, in New York, for example, right, there's been some bail reform rollbacks, but there's also been a promulgation of the need to roll back bail reform by way of attributing that to the increase in crime and shootings, et
Hmm.
cetera, particularly in New York State. Talk a little bit about that because we know there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's
Hmm.
this repeated focus on bail reform as a scapegoat, right?
Yeah.
For example, to what's happening. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of kind of inertia in terms of like this the tough on crime, ideology, right? We still live in a tough on crime age. I'm a communication strategist. What that means is that I spend a lot of time on the phone with press, and around the time that law enforcement and lawmakers in the state of New York were pushing rolling back bail reform this year, I was getting calls from reporters. In particular, I'm thinking about a call I got from a reporter in Albany who said, I'm working on a story about whether or not bail reform has caused crime. Have you been tracking that? Has your organization been tracking that? And I said, well, why would we? No, we haven't been tracking that at all. But she said, well, the police are telling me that bail reform caused crime. And I said to her, have they got any data for you on that? And she said, no. That's why I'm asking you guys. And I said, this is ridiculous, right? Like the law enforcement are putting forward these claims that crime is going up because of bail reform, and they presumably have all the data at their disposal that they could use to prove that with, but they are refusing to release it. And that doesn't, it's astonishing to me that doesn't register as suspicious to more people.
Right.
But unfortunately, those talking points and that pressure have percolated up through the media, who are, oftentimes not willing to question the points that they receive or the press releases they receive from police departments. And it has led to some rollback of bail reform.
And who are the groups that are pushing those, like the need to roll back bail reform? Because obviously there's groups that are interested in doing that.
Well, my understanding is that it's a lot of law enforcement, it's a lot of prosecutors groups, but I think it's also politicians that just see this as sort of an easy grab, I think that if, for instance, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, pushed very hard for rolling back bail reform, and I think that was misguided, and I think that's something that he might see this as something where he can score some points, understanding that he is the mayor of a city where public opinion about the mayor turns on what the mayor's response to crime is, and that if he says, okay, we're just going to roll back bail reform, people will think, okay, at least he's doing something. But they'll ignore the fact that he's not doing much of anything to stop traffic-related deaths, right? He's not doing anything to stop, for instance, huge semi-trucks coming through city streets and killing people. Not doing anything to prevent people from driving drunk. All these things that cause harm. He's not doing that much on those issues. And so I think that he and other politicians see bail reform as kind of an easy score, to get their points on, to get their kind of political points up.
Wanda Bertram, thanks so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars. We really appreciate that. Your report, how can people get access to your report?
Well, thank you. It's been so great to be here. Our report is on our website, which is prisonpolicy.org. If you go to our website and you go to our publications page, you should be able to see it right there at the top.
Again, Wanda Bertram from the Prison Policy Initiative. Thanks so much again for joining us. And we want to thank you for giving us your thoughts and observations. I thank you, the viewers, for joining us all here on this thought-provoking discussion. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at www.fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and I appreciate you all joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.